The diplomatic chamber aboard the trade station hummed with the usual business of intergalactic commerce. Commander Jake Morrison sat across from Ambassador Vela, a representative of the Corithian Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy. Her iridescent skin caught the artificial light, casting prismatic patterns across the negotiation table. "So we have an agreement then," Jake said, reviewing the holographic contract floating between them. "Earth supplies the medical compounds, and your empire provides the water purification technology." Vela's three-fingered hand hovered over the confirmation pad. Her large obsidian eyes studied the human with an intensity that made lesser species uncomfortable. Humans, however, rarely showed such weakness. "One moment," she said, her voice carrying the melodic quality common to her people. "I must consult with my advisors regarding a timeline." She tapped a device on her wrist, and several Corithian officials materialized as holograms around the table. They spoke in their native tongue, a language of harmonic tones that Jake had tried and failed to learn during his diplomatic training. The conversation grew heated. Vela's skin color shifted from its usual silver blue to a darker shade, indicating stress or disagreement. Finally, she waved her hand, and the holograms vanished. "I apologize, Commander Morrison," Vela said, her posture stiffening. "After consultation with my government, I must inform you that we are withdrawing from this negotiation. The terms are not as favorable as we initially believed." Jake leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "I understand. These things happen in diplomacy." Vela stared at him, her skin flickering through several color variations in rapid succession. "You understand? That is all?" "Well, yes," Jake said, standing and extending his hand. "I appreciate the time you spent reviewing our proposal. Perhaps we can revisit this arrangement in the future when circumstances are more favorable for both parties." The Corithian ambassador remained seated, her mouth opening and closing several times without producing sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was higher than before, almost strained. "You are withdrawing as well? Just like that?" "You're the one who withdrew from the negotiation," Jake said, confused. "I'm simply acknowledging your decision and respecting it." Vela stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the metal floor. "This is impossible. How can you be so calm? Where is your outrage? Your demands for compensation?" Jake frowned. "Compensation for what? You exercised your right to decline an agreement. That's perfectly acceptable." "Acceptable?" Vela's voice rose to a pitch that made the station's ambient systems adjust their audio filters. "On Corythia, withdrawal from negotiations after reaching this stage would result in immediate sanctions, possible military action, and certainly a declaration of insult that could take generations to resolve." The human commander felt a cold sensation run down his spine. "You mean you expected me to react with hostility?" "Expected? It is the only reasonable response," Vela said, pacing now. Her diplomatic composure had completely shattered. "When the Zelthrons withdrew from a trade agreement with us 3 cycles ago, it nearly sparked a war. We had to pay them substantial reparations just for considering withdrawal, even though we ultimately proceeded with the deal." Jake slowly sat back down, processing this information. "Ambassador Vela, I think we may have encountered a significant cultural misunderstanding. On Earth, either party has the right to withdraw from negotiations at any point before a final agreement is signed. It's considered a fundamental aspect of free negotiation." "Free negotiation?" Vela stopped pacing and looked at him with what could only be described as horror. "You mean to tell me that humans can simply walk away from talks without consequence?" "Not without consequence," Jake clarified. "There might be hurt feelings or damaged relationships, depending on how it's handled. But legal or military consequences? No, that would be absurd. How would anyone negotiate in good faith if they felt trapped?" Vela's skin had now turned a pale white, a color Jake had never seen on a Corithian before. She slowly lowered herself back into her chair. "This explains so much about human behavior in the Galactic Council," she whispered. "We thought your species was either incredibly brave or dangerously reckless." Ambassador Thorne withdrew from 17 different negotiations last year alone. "Thorne's good at her job," Jake said with a slight smile. "She knows when something isn't right for Earth's interests. She doesn't waste time on bad deals. She should have been executed, or at minimum, her planet should have faced embargo," Vela said, though her tone now carried wonder rather than anger. Instead, many of those same parties came back to negotiate with her again, sometimes with better terms. "Exactly," Jake said, "because they knew she was serious when she said yes. If someone is forced to agree, their word means nothing. If they choose to agree, knowing they could walk away, that carries weight." Vela was silent for a long moment, her skin slowly returning to its normal silver-blue hue. "Commander Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I require complete honesty. This is crucial. Of course, if I were to reinstate my interest in this negotiation, would you hold my withdrawal against Earth? Would there be penalties or hidden costs worked into future dealings?" Jake shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. We'd be happy to continue discussing the terms. Your withdrawal told me that something about the arrangement didn't work for your people. If we can address that concern, great. If not, we part as friends and potential future partners." The Corithian ambassador stood again, but this time her movements were graceful rather than agitated. She approached Jake and performed a gesture he recognized as a sign of deep respect in her culture, placing both hands over her chest and bowing slightly. "Commander Morrison, I believe I need to reconvene my advisory council. However, I must first ask them to approach this negotiation from an entirely different perspective. We have been operating under assumptions about human behavior that were clearly incorrect." "I'm glad we could clear that up," Jake said. "Though I'm curious about something now. If withdrawing is so serious in most galactic cultures, how do negotiations ever fail? Surely not every deal makes sense for both parties." Vela returned to her seat, her posture now relaxed for the first time since the meeting began. "Typically, we negotiate the penalties for withdrawal before we negotiate the actual terms. Sometimes the penalty clauses take longer to draft than the agreement itself. It's a way of ensuring both parties are truly committed." "That sounds incredibly stressful," Jake said. "It is," Vela admitted, "but we thought it was necessary. Now I'm beginning to wonder if humans have discovered something the rest of the galaxy has missed. Your species has formed more new trade partnerships in the last 10 years than most civilizations form in a century. We attributed it to human aggression or desperation. Maybe it's just because we're easy to talk to," Jake offered. "If people know they can say no without fear, they're more willing to say yes when it really matters." Vela's skin shimmered through a pattern Jake had learned indicated thoughtfulness. "There is wisdom in that. Commander Morrison, I would like to not only continue our current negotiation, but also propose a secondary discussion. Would Earth be interested in serving as a neutral mediator for disputes between Corythia and some of our neighboring systems? Your unique cultural perspective on withdrawal and negotiation might prove valuable." Jake smiled. "I'd need to run that up the chain of command, but I suspect they'd be very interested. Building bridges is kind of our specialty." "I'm starting to understand that," Vela said. "Though I must warn you, when word gets out about human negotiation practices, you may find yourselves overwhelmed with requests. Many civilizations have conflicts that have festered for generations, all because neither side can withdraw from talks without triggering a crisis. We'll deal with that when it happens," Jake said. "For now, let's focus on getting this medical compound deal worked out. You mentioned the terms weren't as favorable as you initially thought. Can you be specific about what concerns your advisors raised?" Vela pulled up the holographic contract again, and for the next hour, they worked through the details. What struck Jake most was how Vela's entire negotiating style changed once she understood she could walk away at any point. She became more direct, less defensive, and more creative in proposing solutions. By the time they finished, they had crafted an agreement that gave Corythia more favorable payment terms in exchange for Earth, receiving additional water purification units. Both sides were satisfied, and more importantly, both sides had arrived at that satisfaction without fear. As they prepared to part ways, Vela paused at the chamber door. "Commander Morrison, I have one final question. When I initially withdrew from the negotiation, were you truly not angry with me?" Jake thought about it honestly. "I was a little disappointed. I thought we had a good deal on the table. But angry? No. I figured you had your reasons. Your people are very strange human," Vela said, but her tone was warm. "However, I'm beginning to think it's the rest of us who have been doing things the strange way." "Different isn't strange," Jake replied. "It's just different. The trick is learning from each other." After Vela departed, Jake remained in the chamber, filing his report for Earth Command. He